Hello and welcome to Spinster's Library. I'm Claudia and today I'm starting my reread of my least favourite Jane Austen novel, which is Mansfield Park. I read this book for the first time, I believe, 2 years ago, and I really disliked it, which was such a disappointment because I'm a huge fan of Jane Austen's other works. Every single Jane Austen novel I've read I have enjoyed, some of them I have loved, but this one I could not get on with at all. So today I am going to start my reread of this and I'm going to take you along as I react to this novel chapter by chapter. Before we get into it, two things. First, there will be spoilers. There will be so many spoilers for this. Do not watch this video if you haven't read Mansfield Park. And secondly, do not watch this novel if you are seriously attached to this book and cannot handle a negative opinion, because I can't promise that I'm going to love this book on a reread. The first time I read this, I just really disliked pretty much everything about this book. I didn't like the characters. The only two characters I remember being vaguely enjoyable are Mary Crawford and Mrs. Norris. I seriously disliked the main character, Fanny Price. I didn't like the narrative, I didn't like the romance, I didn't like the plot, I didn't like the style. I just did not get on with this novel at all. And I cannot promise that this is going to be any different on a reread. Now, of course, I'm going to try and enjoy this book. I'm going to try and love it as much as I love Jane Austen's other works, but I promise nothing. There might be anger, there might be swearing, there might be throwing the book across the room. So be warned. But now, let's get into my reread of Mansfield Park, chapter by chapter. And there are a lot of chapters. This is probably going to be quite a long video. We get straight into the backstory of the Ward sisters. We have the beautiful one who ends up marrying a baronet. We have the slightly less lucky one who ends up marrying a parson. And then we have the rebel who ends up marrying a sailor. And the former two decide to adopt one of the children of the unfortunate third sister. Now, I say the former two, but actually it's very much Sir Thomas Bertram and Mrs. Norris that make that decision. Lady Bertram doesn't really seem to care either way, which is quite funny. She's just like, well, I hope she doesn't bother the dog, as they decide which of their nieces and nephews to adopt. Of course, the choice falls on the eldest, Fanny Price. I actually really like this setup for a story. I like the sort of Cinderella-esque connotations. I like the disconnect that is immediately created between Fanny and her cousins. You know, there's Mrs. Norris making sure that Fanny isn't going to come in with any grand aspirations, and that she will always be someone who knows her place and who knows of her good fortune in being essentially fostered by this rich family. So yeah, I like the backstory, I like the setup of this novel, and actually finishing this first chapter makes me a lot more hopeful that I'll enjoy the rest as well. This is the montage of Fanny Price growing up at the Bertrams, and pretty much like we guessed in the first chapter, we have the parents pretty much absent, we have the aunt who gets way too involved, we have the evil stepsisters, just like in Cinderella, and then we have Edmund, who is the only decent person in this book. Fanny Price herself is shy, and that is her entire personality. Mrs. Norris, Auntie Norris, has shown herself to be the worst and also the best simultaneously. I love how she managed to wriggle out of her responsibility for taking care of her niece by playing the "look at me, I'm a poor widow" card. Yeah, That's pretty masterful right there. Sir Thomas is going off to look after his business, which I'm just assuming is going to be a plantation run by enslaved people in Antigua, where he's also taking his oldest son, which makes Fanny sad, but no one else seems to care because Sir Thomas is the picture of the benevolent but absent father. We're still kind of setting up the story, there isn't much plot happening just yet. So finally we've got all of the pieces set up. We have Maria Bertram engaged to Mr. Rushford, who she doesn't really care about and who doesn't seem a very interesting sort of person, but he's very rich, so that will do. We have Sir Thomas Bertram still away, but his eldest son come back. And most importantly, we have the arrival of the Crawford siblings, who really set this entire plot in motion. So it only took us 4 chapters to finally get the plot going. So we get a bit more insight into the Crawfords' plans and aspirations. And I actually like that we hear what the Crawfords are saying to each other, because let's be honest, they are the most interesting characters in this novel. I still have absolutely no attachment to Fanny Price. I find her incredibly dull, which is exactly how I remember her from last time. But anyway, Mary Crawford has her eyes set on Tom Bertram, the older one, because he's a future baronet, of course. Henry Crawford is supposed to like the younger Miss Bertram, which is Julia. But as he admits himself, he does kind of prefer the older one, who is, of course, engaged. Scandalous. We've just had a dinner party, and that's kind of revealed the characters' personalities a bit more. Mr. Rushworth is pretty much only interested in his own gigantic estate. No one else seems to care about it apart from Mrs. Norris, who is, as we've already established, overly involved in rich people's affairs. Mary Crawford, and this is something I find quite interesting, we actually get a lot of her inner dialogue. We actually get a lot of her inner thoughts and her personality, and she's just kind of flirting and bitching about sailors and generally actually being quite fun. I know that she's the villain in this, I know that she's the mean girl, but at least she has a personality, because Fanny Price, her entire character seems to be based on this idea of her being meek and quiet and shy and not confident. And it's not the fact that she's quiet that bothers me about her, because there are lots of Jane Austen heroines that I like who are also quiet. Anne Elliot is quiet. Eleanor Dashwood is quiet. Fanny Price is dull, and her entire character is just based on this, oh, poor little me, I'm not allowed to go with my cousins because they are all so much better than me. And again, I understand the function of this within the narrative. I understand that a big part of her development is her coming out of her shell, but I just find her so unlikable from the beginning that I don't get any satisfaction out of the fact that she then comes out of her shell and becomes her own person. Well, let's see if that changes this time. Just something about reading about her makes me all enraged. I mean, other than that, I actually really enjoyed this chapter. I think the conversation's funny. We get the different characters interacting with each other. I'm liking the book so far, but I really dislike the main character. Edmund very predictably has started to completely ignore Fanny because he's so into Mary Crawford, and we can blame him because she is the more interesting personality, but it's still obviously really mean how both Mary and Edmund are treating Fanny. Mary isn't vindictive or mean or jealous. She is just quite selfish, which shows itself in the whole horse situation. So Edmund's got this horse, which is nominally his, but is used by Fanny to improve her health. And he just kind of takes it away from her and hands it to Mary so that she can learn how to ride, which then leads to Fanny having a very dramatic fit of the headaches. And only then does Edmund realise that he has been neglecting his poor little cousin. But it still bothers me that she can't stand up for herself. And I understand the kind of social structures around this. I understand that Fanny is the Cinderella, that she feels like she doesn't have any right to be in this family in the first place. She feels like she doesn't have any right to be well cared for. And that is not an imagined situation, of course, because we see, for example, how her aunts treat her. And her aunt, Lady Bertram, is essentially her adopted mother, and she still has her kind of treated like a servant. So I can understand Fanny's situation, and I can understand why she is so quiet and unassuming. Nuance. I get it, but I don't like it. Everyone's on a road trip. Road trip, road trip, road trip, road trip, road trip, road trip. I do like it when they go on road trips in Jane Austen. So our friends are now at Sotherton, where Mr. Crawford is flirting with Maria, who is ignoring her fiancé. Julia Bertram is also feeling quite ignored. And Edmund is head over heels in love with Mary Crawford. And she is into him too. And this is something I find interesting because she had her eyes set on the elder, Mr. Bertram, on Tom Bertram, because she wants the estate and the money. And she still finds herself falling for Edmund, even though he's the younger brother, going into a profession that she doesn't really care for. Interesting. This chapter feels almost like a scene from a Shakespeare play. We have everyone running around in the grounds of Sotherton, which is Mr. Rushworth's estate, where they road tripped to. And we have basically everyone unhappy, everyone missing each other, and everyone kind of being mean to other people. So there is Mr. Rushworth being just left behind by Maria as she climbs over a fence with Henry Crawford, which I'm sure there's no symbolism there whatsoever. And then we have Fanny being ignored by Edmund as he goes off flirting with Miss Crawford. So some very unhappy people there. And Julia generally being left with Mrs. Norris and the housekeeper, which she's not happy about either. I did actually really enjoy this chapter. I thought this was really well written, this was really well crafted. Like I said, it has that aspect of kind of a Shakespeare comedy. It's really well done. I'm starting to really enjoy the book for its style and its narration. Okay, this was a really good chapter. This had a real kind of cinematography about it that I haven't seen so far in this novel or in many other sort of Jane Austen scenes. We start with kind of a general setting of the scene. There is the threat of the father of the house returning from Antigua, and Maria is dreading it because that means her marriage to Mr. Rushworth, who she doesn't really like. And also it means that Edmund is going to take orders and become a vicar, which really pisses off Mary Crawford. And most of this chapter is this scene where they stand by the window, Mary, Edmund and Fanny, and they talk about the profession of the vicar. And Mary Crawford's really quite kind of hateful about it. She's very prejudiced. She's kind of bitter that I guess that the guy that she's chosen is going into such an unglamorous profession as a clergyman. The scene is beautifully written, and it ends with that really melancholic note of Mary Crawford going over to the piano to join in the song, and Edmund and Fanny talking about stargazing, and he says, "Oh, we haven't done any stargazing for a while. Look, there's some stars up there." And then she says, "Yeah, we should go outside and look at the stars." And he says, "Yeah, definitely." And then he walks over to the piano to join the others, leaving Fanny all alone. That is a beautifully written moment, and I'm starting to really appreciate the writing of Mansfield Park, which in a way reminds me a lot more of Persuasion than it does of the other Jane Austen novels. There's a ball and Tom Bertram's back. He dances with Fanny so he can get away from playing cards with his aunt, which is quite fun. Otherwise, it's pretty obvious. Mary's into Edmund, Fanny's into Edmund, Edmund's into Mary. Maria is into Henry Crawford, and Henry Crawford's kind of playing both sisters. This is the setup of the Lovers' Vows theatre acting plot that I really didn't enjoy the first time through. It starts with Edmund's opposition. No, it starts with Mr. Yates arriving, and he is what I expect Americans call a theatre kid. And he really wants to set up a theatre at Mansfield Park, which everyone's a fan of, except Edmund and Fanny. Because Edmund has this idea that surely with Maria Bertram engaged but in love with Mr. Crawford, she is so in danger of like accidentally having sex with him within the context of a theatre play. The preparations for the theatre play are still continuing, and in this chapter everyone's squabbling about who gets which roles. Now what I find most interesting about this chapter is that it seems to be told from the perspective of Julia Bertram. We kind of see the whole scene through her eyes, specifically everyone dunking on her and saying that Maria Bertram should have the main part. Especially Henry Crawford seems very keen on that, wink wink. But yeah, Fanny is pretty much absent from this scene, and I don't mind that at all. Still planning the play, everyone wants Fanny to play some minor role, which she of course objects to. I have to say, I did feel for her when Mrs. Norris has a go at her, telling her she should be grateful for pretty much being allowed to live in this house, and she should therefore accept the part, and then how ungrateful it would be for her not to accept the part. Then there's also conveniently one male role that is as of yet unfilled, and we'll see how that plays out. This was another one of those really beautifully written cinematic kind of scenes. We have Fanny in her old schoolroom, where she's surrounded by all these memories, and she kind of thinks back on her childhood and on the positive influence that Edmund has been. And then he comes in and tells her that he has decided to play the part of Anhalt in the play because he doesn't want some random guy playing it. And of course, that is the part that is opposite Mary Crawford's, I believe. And Edmund is trying to convince himself more than Fanny that that is the morally right thing to do, even though she sees through him and she knows that he is just taking the part because of Mary Crawford. But she doesn't have the guts to actually say that to him. And instead he leaves her and she is just kind of sad about it. But again, just doesn't have the confidence to tell him that she thinks it's wrong, and also to tell him that she thinks that Mary Crawford isn't good for him. Not much else has happened except that Mrs. Grant and Mary Crawford are having a conversation about how willing to cheat Maria Bertram is, and I expect we'll find that answer out very soon. Well, 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 just as everyone's getting all lovey-dovey in the rehearsal, it is the cliffhanger return of Sir Daddy Bertram. Mr. Yates, read the room. Sir Thomas has very quickly put an end to the whole theatre subplot, so I guess it's time for the next subplot to start. Maria is now married to Mr. Rushworth. I always get his name wrong. I wonder how many times in this video I've already said Rushford. Anyway, she's married to Mr. Rushworth, kind of against her better judgment. What could possibly go wrong? Fanny and Mary Crawford are kind of getting closer and becoming friends, which Edmund is really happy about. But Fanny doesn't quite understand why she keeps hanging out with Mary. And actually this is the first chapter where I feel like as a reader you get a real insight into Fanny Price's inner life, because before that her character was pretty much just made up of these attributes of being shy and not confident and feeling like she doesn't deserve to be where she is. But in this chapter we kind of get a bit more complexity in her inner life, which I really appreciate. It doesn't make me sort of like her anymore as a character, but it certainly makes her more well-rounded as a character, and I appreciate that. Otherwise, this chapter was quite melancholy, quite slow-moving, and mostly taken up with this conversation between Mary and Fanny and Edmund, where once again we kind of get the difference in the motivations of Mary and Fanny. I don't quite understand what Edmund sees in Mary Crawford, unless of course he is so impressed by her beauty and harp playing, because they do seem pretty incompatible as people. Fanny is invited to a dinner party, which seems like a really big deal. Mrs. Norris tells her that she should be so grateful for even being thought of. Anyway, Fanny goes to this dinner party at the Grants, where she comes across Henry Crawford, who is back again. And again, we are getting a real insight into Fanny Price's inner life here, because she has an almost visceral reaction of hatred and anger. In fact, the word hate is actually used in this chapter towards Mr. Crawford. He tries to kind of sweet talk her, and you're starting to get to the bit where he is actually interested in her. But she really, really dislikes him, and for some reason that makes me like her a lot more, because she actually stands up to him. She tells him what she thought of the whole theatre idea, and she's starting to really become her own person. A lot happened in this chapter, beginning with Henry Crawford's, I guess, infamous resolution that he's going to make Fanny Price in love with him within 2 weeks. And this is where we see that Mary Crawford is really not a good friend to Fanny, because her reaction is pretty much just, lol, that's hilarious. And then the second half of the chapter is taken up by William's return. So William is, of course, Fanny's sailor brother, who she really loves. And we kind of get him presented as an opposite of Henry Crawford. In fact, Henry Crawford's quite jealous of William's hardship and the fact that he had to work throughout his life, and the fact that he's had to endure so much personal danger. But I really wanted to talk about one passage of this chapter that really struck me, because in this chapter we have, I believe, the first time that we get the narrator's first-person perspective on all of this. I mean, the first time that I've noticed it anyway. Maybe we've had that before in the novel, I didn't pick up on it, but in this chapter we get the passage that kind of takes a step away from the characters and the narrative. And like I said, we get the narrator's first-person voice. This is just after Henry has told Mary that he intends to make Fanny Price love him. And without attempting any further remonstrance, she left Fanny to her fate, a fate which, had not Fanny's heart been guarded in a way unsuspected by Miss Crawford, might have been a little harder than she deserved. For although there doubtless are such unconquerable young ladies of 18, or one should not read about them, as are never to be persuaded into love against their judgment by all that talent, manner, attention, and flattery can do, I have no inclination to believe Fanny one of them, or to think that with so much tenderness of disposition, and so much taste as belonged to her, she could have escaped heart-whole from the courtship, though the courtship only of a fortnight, of such a man as Crawford, in spite of there being some previous ill opinion of him to overcome, had not her affection been engaged elsewhere. This sentence takes up half a page, but essentially what it says is that the narrator believes that Fanny is not in much danger of falling for Henry Crawford because she has this affection for Edmund Bertram. And I just thought that's such a striking piece of observational writing, because it's the first time I've noticed that we get that step back from the narrative. I thought that was really masterfully done, and this paragraph really stands out because of the use of the first-person voice. This is a dinner party at the Grants, and they're all playing cards, and Edmund's talking about his future house at Thornton Lacey. Yep, I don't know what else to say. This was not the most interesting chapter. A ball! Finally, there is to be a ball in this novel, and it is being organised at Mansfield Park without the involvement of Mrs. Norris, which she isn't very happy about. I love that bit, that's hilarious. And then the rest of the chapter is Fanny being bequeathed a necklace by Mary Crawford to go with her amber cross, which William gave her. I seem to remember that there is some sort of trick like that this necklace becomes a plot point at the ball, but I can't remember exactly what it is, so I'm quite interested to see where that story goes. Everyone's getting ready for the ball, and actually lots of things happen. First is that Edmund also gives Fanny a chain for her cross, which obviously she has a moral dilemma over, because which necklace does she wear? Obviously she wants to wear Edmund's, but then she also doesn't want to offend Mary. The second thing that happens is that he sort of takes her into his confidence, and he talks to her about his feelings for Mary, and he also tells her that Mary has as good as rejected him because she doesn't want to be the wife of a clergyman, essentially, is what she says. And the third thing that happens is that Henry Crawford suggests that he can take William back to Portsmouth. So he is kind of doing Fanny a favour there as well. And I expect the next chapter will be the ball, so quite excited to see what happens. Lots of exciting things normally happen at balls in Jane Austen novels. The ball happened, and what a Cinderella moment for Fanny Price. Well, kind of. She finds herself admired by Henry Crawford and her uncle, who seems to be trying really hard to sell her off to Henry Crawford, which is interesting. I guess that tells us about the fallibility of Sir Thomas. It also tells us something about the infallibility of Fanny Price, and I've just realised that this is the reason why I don't really like her as a character. It's because she is too perfect in her judgment of other people. One of the best things about Jane Austen's novels is the imperfections in her heroines, and especially how those heroines get swayed and get persuaded and have their knowledge of people tested. So there's always this aspect of the heroines getting people wrong. And Fanny Price has this ability, I guess, to read everyone instantly. She immediately understands everyone around her. And to me, that's just a bit dull. I get that her conflict lies in another way. You know, the thing that she has to overcome is her self-confidence and her skill in communicating herself to other people. But the fact that she immediately judges everyone right makes her feel less human, less believable, and less likable. Edmund and Henry and William, so all of the important single men, have left now. Mary Crawford's a little bit panicky about Edmund because she rightly thinks that she may have scared him off, and she's worried that he's going to go off and marry some vicar's daughter because he's gone off to get ordained. So next time we'll see Edmund, he will be a vicar. And Fanny Price has no intentions of indulging Mary Crawford in her reveries. Henry's back, and he's had this revelatory conversation with his sister Mary about how he truly loves Fanny Price. This chapter is super interesting. I really enjoyed reading this one, and it's because we get that kind of ambiguity in Henry Crawford's character. He says he really loves Fanny Price, and he's clearly convinced of that himself. But then when he starts listing her good qualities, it's mostly her sort of meekness and how happy she is to please everyone and how she's going to please him as a wife that's mostly attracting him to her, rather than her strength of personality or her opinions or anything that would put them on an equal footing in their marriage. So this is super interesting. I think this is what sets Henry Crawford apart from most other Austen villains. And of course his character isn't going to be redeemed by the end, because we know that he goes and has an affair with Mrs. Rushworth. But at least at this moment, we get an image of someone who's very sincere in his affections, even though he's completely guided by a kind of egotistical selfishness in what he thinks he can bring to this marriage. Anyway, super interesting chapter. Really enjoyed this one. But once again, I have to point out that the chapters I enjoy most are the ones where Fanny Price isn't even present. Henry Crawford has facilitated the promotion of Fanny's brother William, and then in the same breath he proposes marriage to her, essentially. Now she doesn't quite get the chance to give him a straight no because she's too busy panicking about it, but this is a really interesting plot development because we have men doing good things for the women they love in lots of Austen novels, but this is the only one where the man in question immediately boasts about it. In Pride and Prejudice, for example, Darcy does a good thing for Elizabeth without telling her about it, and she only finds out about it by accident. Whereas here, Henry Crawford's pretty much going, I got your brother a promotion, I love you, like without any sort of distinction between the two. And Fanny is predictably all up in a panic because she has no intentions of accepting him, but also she feels gratitude for what he did for her brother's career. Sir Thomas finds it incredibly hard to understand that Fanny Price would turn down Henry Crawford. His explosion at her about this is completely unreasonable. He does soften in the end, and he kind of apologizes to her by way of making sure that she has a fire in her room, which Mrs. Norris has prevented for the last decade. But seriously, that's not okay. So this is the fallout from the whole proposal thing. Henry Crawford tries it on one more time and Fanny rejects him again, which he just cannot comprehend why anyone would turn him down, much like Sir Thomas. And then we get the reactions of all the other people, which are as expected. Henry Crawford is still trying to woo Fanny and she's just not having any of it, and he's trying really clumsily to kind of guess what she's into. So now he's figured out that she's into priests, and he goes on about how he could totally be a priest, and I think subconsciously he knows that she prefers Edmund, but he definitely doesn't know it consciously yet, because this chapter is told from his perspective, so we actually get to see all of his thoughts. He also tells her that she's going to judge him by his action, not his words, which is true. Can all the men in this story just shut up and take no for an answer? I'm talking to you, Edmund Bertram, Sir Thomas Bertram, and most importantly, Henry Crawford. She said no, she doesn't want you, just accept it. There's one scene in this chapter that where, for the first time in the novel, and this is like 3/4 of the way through the novel, I really like Fanny in this scene, when she speaks for pretty much every woman ever in the world who's been hit on by a guy she doesn't like. I should have thought, said Fanny, after a pause of recollection and exertion, that every woman must have felt the possibility of a man's not being approved, not being loved by someone of her sex at least, let him be ever so generally agreeable. Let him have all the perfections in the world. I think it ought not be set down as certain that a man must be acceptable to every woman he may happen to like himself. Yep. It's Mary Crawford's turn to try and convince Fanny one last time, but finally the Crawfords are gone, and Fanny's very happy about it. I'm less happy about it because I really like them as characters. Fanny is about to leave for Portsmouth, where she's going to visit her parents, whom she hasn't seen for like a decade, ever since she came to Mansfield. And Sir Thomas seems to think that her going back into relative poverty is going to convince her to accept Henry Crawford. I don't think that's going to work. Fanny has arrived at her parents' house in Portsmouth, which is a small house with a lot of people in it. When Fanny left her parents, I think she was one of 9 children, but now there have been a few more, so the house is pretty noisy. Her parents are described as poor, but clearly Jane Austen's idea of poor is very different from our 21st century idea of poor, because the Price family still keep at least 2 servants that we've heard of so far, Rebecca being the one that's being complained about a lot. And Fanny just doesn't get the reception that she thought she was going to get. Her parents seem quite disinterested in her, probably because they have so many children to look after. This reminds me so much of my visits to my Italian family as a child, because while my entire family is Italian, I grew up in Germany, right? My home was always fairly quiet, fairly regulated, you know, it's mealtime, it's bedtime, all fairly quiet. And then we'd go and visit the family in Italy, and it was just so loud, and children crying everywhere, and then some would turn the TV up because they couldn't hear the television over the crying of the children, and then someone was arguing in the corner and they would raise their voices because you couldn't hear their arguments over the television. It was so noisy and full of people. And Fanny's experiences in Portsmouth remind me so much of those holidays when I would just try and find like a quiet spot in the house where I could go read my book. I feel for her. The narrative is trying really hard to make me care about Susan Price, but I do not care about Susan Price. Surprise! Henry Crawford shows up in Portsmouth, and Fanny is embarrassed about her family, but he's actually behaving in quite a nice and gentlemanlike way. It's not going to work, Henry. Henry Crawford is quite a bit more pleasant all of a sudden, and Fanny and the reader notice that. More Portsmouth, more Fanny wondering whether Edmund is engaged or not, more wishing that Henry Crawford would just leave her alone. These chapters where Fanny's in Portsmouth are really the first kind of stretch of novel where we continuously see the story from Fanny's perspective. Because previously, we've always had this kind of jump in perspective. You know, we see a scene from Sir Thomas Bertram's perspective, and then the next scene from Henry Crawford, and then the next scene from Maria Bertram, etc. So now we actually get a bit where we spend an entire part of the novel inside Fanny's head. And unfortunately, I find that quite boring. Edmund has written, and it's basically just a long letter saying how disappointed he is in Mary Crawford's conduct and that he doesn't think her morals are quite up to scratch. First of all, as Fanny herself kind of realizes, is that, like, she hasn't really changed. He's just seeing her for the first time. And secondly, Edmund's not affording Mary Crawford her own agency to actually be her own person and have her own personality. Because instead of saying, oh, we're not quite compatible, I suppose, he says, oh yeah, these two women have been such a bad influence on her. And, you know, deep down, she's a pure, innocent creature, but she's been influenced by the evils of London. Get a grip, Edmund. And then the other plot development is that Tom Bertram has fallen out of a carriage while drunk and has contracted a high fever. I actually cannot remember whether he survives this book. I can't remember that from the last read, so I guess there's one bit of plot that I might be surprised by. Ah yes, of course, if Tom Bertram dies, then Edmund's going to be the heir of Mansfield Park, which is going to make Mary Crawford marry him because she likes the money, which makes me think that Tom probably isn't going to die. Here we have the climax of the plot. Maria is run off with Henry Crawford. Julia running off with Mr. Yates to elope to Scotland is like a side note. No one really cares about that. Poor Julia, even by the narrative, she's just like the forgotten sister. What's her name? Fanny is going back to Mansfield. Yeah, we're very much nearing the end of the story now, which is good because this video is probably already like 3 hours long. This is why Edmund Bertram pisses me off, right? Because in this conversation with Fanny, he blames Mary Crawford for deceiving him. But she didn't deceive him. She has always been her authentic self. And he's been deceiving himself in thinking that he saw something else, something more modest and less worldly in her, but she did nothing to deceive him. She's always just been herself. I really dislike that aspect of his character, this kind of butthurt blaming of the woman in question because she didn't live up to his ridiculous standards. So Edmund Bertram with Edward Ferrars is at the bottom of my Jane Austen heroes list, and this reread has done nothing to change my opinion of him. Finished! And I have to say this last chapter was really more of an epilogue, and the morality with which everyone gets their deserved ending reminds me very much of Victorian literature, even though this was quite a few decades before the Victorian period. But everyone gets what they justly deserve. Sir Thomas Bertram, who is kind of the point of view of this epilogue, he learns a lot of lessons, he becomes a nicer person. Fanny gets Edmund and Edmund gets Fanny. Both of them get the parsonage at Mansfield Park after Dr. Grant gets death. Mary Crawford is doomed to be forever alone, as is Maria Bertram, who lives in exile with Auntie Norris. So the lesson there is that they both deserve each other. Who else is left? Julia Bertram is now Julia Yates. It's said that she gets away a little bit more lightly because she was never as spoiled as Maria. Everyone is happy except for the people who don't deserve to be happy, who are unhappy, and the people who don't deserve to be alive, who are dead. Bit of an odd ending, I have to say. But overall, I did enjoy this novel. I am so glad that I did enjoy this novel. I'm not going to give you a review now because this video is already long enough. So if you want my more thought out review for this book, then check out my Jane Austen July wrap up at the end of the month. But I can say that I liked this book despite the main character. I still don't like Fanny Price as much as the other Jane Austen heroines. Although I do understand her character a lot more this time. I still don't like Edmund Bertram as much as the other Jane Austen heroes, but I do understand his character a lot more this time. Overall, I'm really glad I gave this book a second chance. If you are one of the people who read Mansfield Park and hated it, like I was, then I can only encourage you to give it a second go as well, because it really did improve on a reread. It's still probably going to be at the bottom of my Jane Austen novels favourites, but I would say it's now joined with Sense and Sensibility in my enjoyment of it. Both novels I appreciate, I don't love, but I certainly liked this time, and that's all I wanted from this reread. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you've made it to the end, then congratulations, and let me know your opinion of Mansfield Park down below. Thank you for watching. Bye.